By early November 2008, Satoshi's Bitcoin white paper had mostly received discouraging feedback. There were Dillinger's negative inflation remarks, James and Levine claiming Bitcoin wouldn't work, and even the moderator of the cryptography mailing list was not too friendly with the Bitcoin discussion going on. Satoshi may have been feeling a bit down about his invention, which at this point was not yet complete. Would he throw in the towel after so much pushback? Trying to describe the discovery of fire to Neanderthals wasn't going so well. But suddenly, on Friday, November the 7th, Hal Finney enters the chat with this email. Bitcoin seems to be a very promising idea. I like the idea of basing security on the assumption that the CPU power of honest participants outweighs that of the attacker. It is a very modern notion that exploits the power of the long tail. When Wikipedia started, I never thought it would work, but it has proven to be a great success for some of the same reasons. I also do think that there is potential value in a form of unforgeable token whose production rate is predictable and can't be influenced by corrupt parties. This would be more analogous to gold than to fiat currencies. Nick Szabo wrote many years ago about what he called BitGold, and this could be an implementation of that concept. There have also been proposals for building lightweight anonymous payment schemes on top of heavyweight non-anonymous systems, so Bitcoin could be leveraged to allow for anonymity even beyond the mechanisms discussed in the paper. Unfortunately, I am having trouble fully understanding the system. The paper describes key concepts and some data structures, but does not clearly specify the various rules and verifications that the participants in the system would have to follow. In particular, I don't understand exactly what verifications peer-to-peer nodes perform when they receive new blocks from other nodes, and how they handle transactions that have been broadcast to them. For example, it is mentioned that if a broadcast transaction does not reach all nodes, it is okay, as it will get into the blockchain before long. How does this happen? What if the node that creates the next block, the first node to find the hash-cache collision, did not hear about the transaction, and then a few more blocks get added also by nodes that did not hear about that transaction? Do all the nodes that did hear it keep that transaction around, hoping to incorporate it into a block once they get lucky enough to be the one which finds the next collision?
On Saturday, November 8th, Satoshi replied to this question from Hal in a follow-up email with this answer. Right. Nodes keep transactions in their working set until they get into a block. If a transaction reaches 90% of nodes, then each time a new block is found, it has a 90% chance of being in it. Hal then asked,
Or, for example, what if a node is keeping 2 or more chains around, as it waits to see which grows fastest, and a block comes in for chain A, which would include a double spend of a coin that is in chain B. Is that checked for or not? This might happen if someone double spent, and 2 different sets of nodes heard about the 2 different transactions with the same coin. This kind of data management, and the rules for handling all the packets that are flowing around, is largely missing from the paper.
Satoshi answered, that does not need to be checked for. The transaction in whichever branch ends up getting ahead becomes the valid one, the other is invalid. If someone tries to double spend like that, one and only one spend will always become valid, the other's invalid. Receivers of transactions will normally need to hold transactions for perhaps an hour or more to allow time for this kind of possibility to be resolved. They can still respend the coins immediately, but they should wait before taking an action such as shipping goods. Then Hal asked,
I also don't understand exactly how double spending or canceling transactions is accomplished by a superior attacker who is able to muster more computing power than all the honest participants. I see that he can create new blocks and add them to create the longest chain, but how can he erase or add old transactions in the chain? As the attacker sends out his new blocks, aren't there consistency checks which honest nodes can perform to make sure that nothing got erased? More explanation of this attack would be helpful in order to judge the gains to an attacker from this, versus simply using his computing power to mint new coins honestly.
Satoshi replied, "The attacker isn't adding blocks to the end. He has to go back and redo the block his transaction is in and all the blocks after it, as well as any new blocks the network keeps adding to the end while he's doing that. He's rewriting history. Once his branch is longer, it becomes the new valid one." This touches on a key point. Even though everyone present may see the shenanigans going on, there's no way to take advantage of that fact. It is strictly necessary that the longest chain is always considered the valid one. Nodes that were present may remember that one branch was there first and got replaced by another, but there would be no way for them to convince those who were not present of this. We can't have sub-factions of nodes that cling to one branch that they think was first, others that saw another branch first, and others that joined later and never saw what happened. The CPU power proof of work vote must have the final say. The only way for everyone to stay on the same page is to believe that the longest chain is always the valid one, no matter what. Hal then asks,
As far as the spending transactions, what checks does the recipient of a coin have to perform? Does she need to go back through the coin's entire history of transfers and make sure that every transaction on the list is indeed linked into the timestamp blockchain? Or can she just do the latest one?
Satoshi answered, "The recipient just needs to verify it back to a depth that is sufficiently far back in the blockchain, which will often only require a depth of 2 transactions. All transactions before that can be discarded." Hal then asked Satoshi,
Do the timestamp nodes check transactions, making sure that the previous transaction on a coin is in the chain, thereby enforcing the rule that all transactions in the chain represent valid coins?
Satoshi replied with, "Right, exactly. When a node receives a block, it checks the signatures of every transaction in it against previous transactions in blocks. Blocks can only contain transactions that depend on valid transactions in previous blocks or the same block. Transaction C could depend on transaction B in the same block, and B depends on transaction A in an earlier block." Hal finishes his email by saying,
Sorry about all the questions, but as I said, this does seem to be a very promising and original idea, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the concept is further developed. It would be helpful to see a more process-oriented description of the idea, with concrete details of the data structures for the various objects, coins, blocks, transactions, the data which is included in messages, and algorithmic descriptions of the procedures for handling the various events which would occur in this system. You mentioned that you are working on an implementation, but I think a more formal text description of the system would be a helpful next step. Hal Finney.
Satoshi finishes his response to Hal's email with, "I appreciate your questions. I actually did this kind of backwards. I had to write all the code before I could convince myself that I could solve every problem. Then I wrote the paper. I think I will be able to release the code sooner than I could write a detailed spec. You're already right about most of your assumptions where you filled in the blanks." Satoshi Nakamoto. One of the many interesting things about this Satoshi email is his confirmation that he had Bitcoin code almost ready to go on November 8th. He would eventually share this draft code with Hal Finney, James A. Donald, and Ray Dillinger. He may have shared the Bitcoin source code with other people at the time, but those 3 names are the only ones CC'd on a November 18th Hal Finney email that replies to Satoshi. That personal Hal Finney email is titled RE Bitcoin source files attached. Therefore, this implies Satoshi shared his draft Bitcoin code with others sometime between November 8th and November 18th, 2008. In a future segment, we will take a look at this November 2008 draft code and compare it to the released version of Bitcoin source code in January of 2009, 2 months later. On a final note, for those who don't know, Hal Finney is a legendary cryptographer who contributed to Bitcoin and the computer science space throughout his life. He was one of the key people behind PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, and, as we hope to show here, was instrumental in Bitcoin's inception. He also made some of the earliest console games. He is a beloved father and husband.
Making this recording for a few reasons.
If you want to support more of this kind of content, visit shopbitcoin.shop.